On the morning of September 27, 1854, the SS Arctic was 4 days from New York. The passengers knew it. They had been counting. After nearly 2 weeks crossing the North Atlantic from Liverpool, the end of the voyage was close enough to feel, close enough that people had begun packing their trunks again, thinking about carriages and hotels, and the particular relief of solid ground after days of open water. The mood on board was the mood of a journey nearly completed, relaxed, anticipatory. The specific lightness that comes when the hard part is almost over. The Arctic was not just any ship. It was the pride of the Collins Line, the American shipping company that had been built specifically to challenge British dominance of the transatlantic passenger trade. Edward Knight Collins had constructed his fleet with a single purpose: to be better than the Cunard Line in every measurable way. Faster, more luxurious, more powerful. The Arctic and her sister ships were the largest, fastest steamships flying the American flag, and they had delivered on that promise. The Arctic held the transatlantic speed record. Her interiors were lavish by the standards of any vessel afloat: carpeted saloons, private staterooms, a standard of comfort that made the crossing feel less like an ordeal and more like an occasion. On board that morning were approximately 400 people, crew and passengers combined. Among the passengers were some of the most prominent names in American society. Collins himself was not aboard, but members of his family were: his wife, his son, his daughter, several other families of means, traveling in the first-class accommodations that the Arctic had been built to provide. There were also emigrants in the lower decks, Irish and European families making the crossing in the opposite direction from most, heading toward America and whatever America might offer them. By nightfall, 322 of those 400 people would be dead. And the way they died, not the fog, not the collision, not the cold water of the North Atlantic, but the way the people on that ship behaved in the hours between the collision and the sinking, is the reason the Arctic is remembered, is the reason it should be remembered, is the reason that what happened on that ship on a September afternoon in 1854 shook the foundations of how maritime law understood the relationship between a vessel, its crew, and the people in its care. The collision happened at noon. A French steamer called the Vesta, significantly smaller than the Arctic, emerged from a patch of fog off the coast of Newfoundland and struck the Arctic on the starboard side. The impact was violent enough to be felt throughout the ship, violent enough to alarm the passengers immediately, but not violent enough, in those first moments, to communicate the full reality of what had happened below the waterline. The Vesta took the worst of the visible damage. Her bow was crushed. She appeared from the Arctic's deck to be in immediate danger of sinking. Captain James Luce of the Arctic, assessing the situation in those first chaotic minutes, made a decision that was arguably defensible as seamanship and was catastrophic in its consequences. He turned the Arctic away from the Vesta and headed at full speed toward the Newfoundland coast. Approximately 50 miles away, believing that the Arctic's damage was manageable and that reaching land was the priority. What he did not yet fully understand was what the Arctic's carpenter understood when he went below to assess the hull. The Arctic had been struck in a way that had opened multiple holes below the waterline. Water was entering the ship not in a single catastrophic breach, but in several places simultaneously. And the pumps, the mechanical systems designed to manage water ingress, were not keeping pace. The ship was filling, not quickly enough to be immediately obvious from the deck, not slowly enough to be stopped, but steadily. With the particular mathematical certainty of water moving through openings it cannot be prevented from moving through, Captain Luce was told. The full reality of the situation was communicated to him within the first hour. What happened next on the decks of the SS Arctic is a sequence of events that was reconstructed afterward from the accounts of the men who survived it. And the reconstruction is not comfortable, and it was not meant to be. The lifeboats began to be deployed. There were enough lifeboats on the Arctic, or nearly enough, by the standards of 1854, which were not demanding standards, to accommodate a significant portion of those on board. The process of loading and launching those lifeboats was, from the first moments, not orderly. It was not orderly in a specific and deliberate way. meaning that the disorder was not the result of panic overwhelming organization, but of organization never being imposed in the first place. The crew loaded themselves. This is the sentence that the survivors kept returning to in their accounts, the sentence that the newspapers printed and reprinted, the sentence that the public fastened onto because it was the sentence that made the entire disaster something other than a tragedy of nature. The crew of the SS Arctic, not all of them, not every man, but enough of them, in sufficient numbers and with sufficient organization among themselves, took the lifeboats. They lowered them, they got in them, and they rowed away from a sinking ship that still held hundreds of people, including women, including children, including infants. One boat was launched with 40 crewmen in it. 40 crewmen in a lifeboat built for perhaps 20, rowing away from a ship that held the wife and children of the man who had built the vessel, who had named the vessel, who had staked his fortune and his reputation on the vessel. The passengers who remained, the first-class passengers in their fine staterooms, the emigrants in the lower decks, the children and their mothers, were left with a ship that was sinking and a diminishing collection of means by which to leave it. Some of the male passengers attempted to construct rafts from deck materials. This effort was genuine and desperate, and produced structures that were, in the cold reality of the North Atlantic in late September, barely adequate. Some of these rafts floated, some did not. Some held their occupants long enough to matter, most did not. The women and children are the center of this story. And they were the center of it at the time, because the specific horror of what happened on the Arctic was not simply that people died. People died in maritime disasters with depressing regularity in the 19th century. The specific horror was who survived and who did not, and what that distribution said about the people who made the decisions that produced it. Of the approximately 400 people on the Arctic that morning, roughly 88 survived. Of those 88 survivors, the overwhelming majority were crew members. Of the passengers who survived, nearly all were men. Of the women on board the Arctic, and there were dozens traveling with their families. Traveling as passengers who had paid for passage on a ship that had implicitly promised them safe transport, not one survived. Not one. Every woman on the SS Arctic died. Every child died. The Collins family, the wife and children of the man whose name was on the company, whose money had built the ship, who had put his family on board his own vessel, died. Every one of them. In the water of the North Atlantic, within sight of lifeboats that had rowed away. The news reached New York before the survivors did, in the way that terrible news sometimes travels faster than the people carrying it. When the accounts began to come in, the survivor testimony, the reconstructed timeline, the specific details of what had been done and who had done it, the public reaction was not simply grief. It was something harder and more sustained than grief. It was a collective confrontation with a question that the disaster had made impossible to avoid. What are the obligations of men to women and children when a ship is sinking? This question sounds from the distance of a century and a half, like a question about gender roles and social codes of the Victorian era. And it is that, but it is also something more fundamental. It is a question about what a society means when it sells a person a ticket on a vessel and tells them they will be safe. It is a question about what crew members owe the people in their care. It is a question about the relationship between physical power, the power to take a lifeboat seat by force if necessary, and moral obligation. In 1854, the answer that the survivors of the Arctic had provided was one answer. It was not the answer that the public accepted. The concept of women and children first, which sounds like it should have been a universal maritime principle long before 1854, but which was in fact still being negotiated as a social norm in the mid-19th century, hardened significantly in the aftermath of the Arctic disaster. The outrage was specific and productive in the way that outrage sometimes is when it has a clear and documentable injustice to fasten onto. The crew of the Arctic had not followed any principle of women and children first. They had followed the principle of crew first, of self first. of the people with the physical access and the nautical knowledge to operate the lifeboats, using that access and knowledge to save themselves. The maritime industry in America was forced to confront what its safety standards actually required of its crews, not what they implied, not what passengers assumed, what they actually legally binding required. The answer in 1854 was not enough. The regulations were insufficient. The training was insufficient. The accountability for crewmen who abandoned passengers was insufficient. Edward Collins himself was broken by what happened. He had not been on the ship. He had been in New York when he received the news that his wife and his children were gone. The fortune that he had built on speed and luxury and the pride of American shipping could not be recovered. The Collins line struggled financially for the remaining years of its existence and was eventually dissolved. The Arctic disaster followed 2 years later by the loss of another Collins vessel, the Pacific, which disappeared entirely in the North Atlantic with all hands and was never found. Ended the American challenge to British transatlantic dominance for a generation. The Vesta, the French steamer that had struck the Arctic and had appeared, in those first moments after the collision, to be in immediate danger of sinking, the Vesta survived. Her passengers and crew survived. Her captain had kept his ship together, managed the damage, and eventually limped into port. The smaller, seemingly more damaged vessel outlasted the larger, faster, more celebrated one, because the smaller vessel's crew had stayed at their posts. This irony was not lost on the press of the era, and it was not lost on the maritime industry. The lessons of the Arctic were absorbed slowly and incompletely, as maritime lessons tended to be in an era where disasters were common and the pressure to move on was constant. But they were absorbed. The conversations about crew obligation, about lifeboat priority, about the responsibility of a ship's officers to maintain order during an evacuation, those conversations were advanced by the Arctic, in ways that fed into the developing body of maritime law and practice over the following decades. When the Titanic sank in 1912, 58 years after the Arctic, in the same North Atlantic waters, with the same fundamental dynamic of insufficient lifeboats and questions of who would fill them, the principle of women and children first was applied more consistently, though still imperfectly. The conversation that produced that application had been going on for more than half a century. The Arctic was part of that conversation. The women who died in the cold water off Newfoundland in September 1854 were part of that conversation, as the evidence that the conversation was not academic. What the Arctic leaves behind, beyond the specific grief of specific families, is a question about what we owe each other in extremity. The crew members who rowed away from that ship were not monsters. They were people in a life-threatening situation who made choices about their own survival that most human beings, confronted with the same situation in the same moment, might also make. That is what makes the question hard. The easy version of this story has villains who chose selfishness when heroism was available. The true version is more uncomfortable. It is about systems. It is about training. It is about the standards and expectations and legal frameworks that determine what people do when the ship is sinking and the lifeboat is within reach and there is no one forcing them to wait for the women and the children. When there is no system, people save themselves. This is not a moral failing unique to the crew of the Arctic. It is a human constant. The purpose of the system, the drills, the regulations, the officer accountability, the clear chain of command during an evacuation is to give people something to follow when instinct is pulling them somewhere else. The Arctic had no such system. 322 people paid for that absence. Among them, every woman on board, every child. The fog off Newfoundland does not remember their names. The North Atlantic does not keep records. But the maritime law that hardened in the years after September 27, 1854, the training requirements and evacuation protocols and officer responsibilities that became standard practice on vessels crossing every ocean, those things remember. They were written in the specific and irreversible language of what happens when they do not exist.